What are some of the most mysterious unexplained events recorded in history? Story 1. One of my favorite ocean mysteries is the 52 hertz whale. It's a whale whose regular call is a very different frequency and pattern from that of any other baleen whale ever heard. So different that scientists aren't entirely sure what species of whale it might be, although it has a migration pattern slightly similar to those of fin and blue whales. One theory is that the whale is of a known species, but is deformed or possibly even deaf. It's called Blue 52, and I want to see it. Well, a lot of people do. Death or otherwise, its calls have unfortunately never been responded to. Because whale songs are actually conversations, this is really sad. Because we can't find Blue 52, there is a debate about why its call is so strange, whether it's deformed, deaf, or just has a squeaky voice, or if it is possibly a subspecies through mutation but cannot find a mate. Another ongoing debate is to why it is not replied to. And there are two equally sad theories. Due to the high pitched nature of its voice, other whales do not want to talk to it because it is weird, effectively an outcast. There is also a theory that whether they want to or not, other whales cannot respond because Blue 52's call is outside of their hearing range. Either way, it's a very sad thought about a possibly disabled whale bumbling about in the deep blue all alone, constantly calling to try and make a friend, but never getting a response. Story 2. Because I'm in an ancient Rome binge phase right now, the disappearance of the Ninth Legion. Over 5,000 Roman soldiers stationed in Great Britain were never mentioned again in historical records after 120 AD. They simply disappeared from history. Considering that we have a respectable amount of primary sources for the losses of other religions throughout Rome's lengthy military history, this is a bit odd. Theories range from destruction in wars against local tribes to aliens, of course. Doctor Who even did an episode on them. Story 3. Gloria Ramirez, aka the Toxic Lady. About 8:15 p.m. on the evening of February 19th, 1994, Ramirez, suffering from the effects of advanced cervical cancer, was brought into the emergency room of Riverside General Hospital by paramedics. She was extremely confused and was suffering from tachycardia and Cheney-Stokes respiration. The medical staff injected her with diazepam, midazolam, and lorazepam to sedate her. When it became clear that Ramirez was responding poorly to treatment, the staff tried to defibrillate her heart. At that point, several people saw an oily sheen covering Ramirez's body, and some noticed a fruity, garlic-like odor that they thought was coming from her mouth. A registered nurse named Susan Kane attempted to draw blood from Ramirez's arm and noticed an ammonia-like smell coming from the tube. She passed the syringe to Julie Gorchinsky, a medical resident, who noticed manila-colored particles floating in the blood. At this point, Kane fainted and was removed from the room. Shortly thereafter, Gorchinsky began to feel nauseated, complaining that she was lightheaded. She left the trauma room and sat at a nurse's desk. A staff member asked her if she was okay. But before she could respond, she also fainted. Maureen Welch, a respiratory therapist who was assisting in the trauma room, was the third to pass out. The staff was then ordered to evacuate all emergency room patients to the parking lot outside the hospital. Overall, 23 people became ill and 5 were hospitalized. A skeleton crew stayed behind to stabilize Ramirez. At 8:50 p.m., after 40 minutes of CPR and defibrillation, Ramirez was pronounced dead from kidney failure related to her cancer. Story 4. I forgot a lot of the info about this one, but the music on the dark side of the moon, probably faked. Pretty simple story. During 1969, during the Apollo 10 mission, for 1 hour they had to orbit behind the moon. During this period, NASA lost touch with them, and they were on their own. At one point, they start to receive a whistling signal. When it starts, they begin talking about how it sounds like outer space music. The only concern is that they have no reaction to it. They just take it as something expected. Story 5. Harold Holt, Australian Prime Minister when swimming in 1967, disappeared and his body never recovered. No one is exactly sure what happened to him, but he was presumed dead. The surf that day was said to be pretty fierce, and Holt was possibly suffering from a heart condition that had made him pass out earlier that year. He also had almost drowned at least once while skin diving in 67. It's pretty likely that his health problems acted up when he was too far out, and he got pulled under in a way. The mystery is that nobody knows what issue specifically caused it, but it's more or less known that he was suffering from a shoulder issue. and a possible heart issue, both of which would have prevented him from surviving the surf. Story 6. Here are some I'm fascinated by. Tara Calico. While there are plenty of missing persons cases from around the world, this one is pretty chilling for a disturbing photograph. Tara vanished in New Mexico in September 1988. In June 1989, a woman discovered a Polaroid in a Florida parking lot, which showed a girl bearing similar resemblance to Tara, as well as an unknown young boy who appear to be bound and with type over their mouths, and could be in the back of a van, in the trunk of a car, or in a room somewhere. Supposedly, a windowless cargo van was seen near where the photo was found and was gone when the woman exited the store and found the picture. Not necessarily a mysterious, unexplained event, but surely creepy. Tunguska event. In June 1908, a huge explosion decimated 80 million trees in a 2,000 kilometer square area and caused no human casualties. It's theorized to be a meteor that disintegrated before it hit the ground, because there was no impact crater found. I find it very interesting that such a cataclysmic occurrence happened, but we don't fully know exactly what it was. Story 7. This isn't well documented anywhere and has been reported to be a hoax, but it still fascinates me. In the early 50s, a guy showed up at Tokyo airport with a passport from a country that didn't exist called Taured. He had numerous world currencies with him and pointed to Andorra when asked to identify Taured on a map. Tokyo authorities put him in a hotel overnight until they could figure out what was going on, and he disappeared from a guarded room with no trace. Some people call the guy a time traveler, I think. If he existed, he was some kind of organized criminal. Story 8. For me, just out of sheer curiosity, I'd like to know what the hell was going on in April of 1561, where the good people of Nuremberg basically witnessed today what might be called a drone battle, air battle. It sure beats the hell out of the more recent decades, in that there's almost nothing like it except a couple of maybe copycat incidents that may or may not have occurred. Something like this occurs again in 1566 in Basel, Switzerland. In this way, unlike modern times, these folks would have almost no reference point for a sky battle or celestial event. Story 9. This might not mean much to many, but Harris Burdick is a pretty big mystery in the literary world. So basically, in the early 1980s, a children's book editor named Peter Wenders was brought a collection of illustrations by a man who called himself Harris Burdick. He gave Wenders the illustrations and accompanying blurbs from stories he'd apparently written for all of them. Burdick told Wenders he'd come back the next day with the manuscripts, but he never returned. Wenders tried to locate him, but he couldn't find anything about a Harris Burdick. Eventually, a book of the illustrations and accompanying sentence blurbs was published, and while the publishers thought this might lead new information on Harris Burdick to surface, all that turned up was another illustration that was found. Story 10. I don't know if you'd be interested in this, but Ellen White, the church prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, wrote a prophecy in 1909 in which she described tall towers in New York City stretching higher and higher to the sky and built by people who made their wealth through unjust financial transactions. Then she described the buildings on fire, firefighters being unable to put out the fires, and the towers being consumed quickly and rapidly. Her exact words were, as if they were made of pitch. The best part? She wrote this in a book called Testimonies for the Church, Volume 9. The article begins on page 11 of that book. The actual description of the fire is found on page 12 and 13. I read the passage myself in a dusty old book 2 weeks after 9/11 happened and was floored. She had a few other interesting prophecies in her lifetime that were fulfilled, and many of her writings on health, which went against the science of her day, were proven correct by science 100 years later, notably her assertion that smoking was bad for a person's health. Not everything she wrote was correct, yet, but the things she said came from visions were the most accurate things she wrote, and the more of herself she injected into her writings, the less accurate they became. Story 11. The Princes in the Tower. The two sons of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville were moved to the Tower of London, ostensibly to prepare for the coronation of the oldest son, also called Edward. Then they disappeared and were never seen or heard from again. The most common theory is that Richard III, younger brother of Edward IV, had them murdered to remove any obstacles to him taking the throne. But there are several other candidates as well. Flash forward a couple of hundred years to the Stuart era, and workers working on restoring the Tower of London discovered two small skeletons buried underneath some old stairs. The king at the time, Charles I, believed that these skeletons were the bodies of the two princes and had them placed in Westminster Abbey for a proper royal burial. In the 1930s, I believe, the coffins were exhumed and studies were conducted on the skeletons to determine who they belonged to. Unfortunately, at the time, technology couldn't tell us everything. But they did confirm they were indeed the skeletons of two children, and one was believed to be older, or at least taller than the other, as the one of the femur from one skeleton was noticeably longer than the other skeleton's femur. The Royal Society of Richard III, yes, really, wants the skeletons to be re-examined to determine exactly who the skeletons belong to finally put it to rest. But due to the fact they are protected by royal decree and housed in the abbey, the bones are unlikely to be allowed to be looked at again. Story 12. Elisa Lamb. For those of you that don't know, in January 2013, Elisa checked into Cecil Hotel. A video of her last known time she was seen alive was released, and a few weeks after she disappeared, she was found in the hotel's water tank. Due to the size of the tanks requiring you to use a ladder to reach the top from the outside and the weight of their lids, she couldn't have gotten in and closed the lids herself. The Dyatlov Pass Incident. In 1959, Igor Dyatlov, hence the name, and 8 friends were trekking the Ural Mountains. Dyatlov said that he would send out a telegram when they returned. 8 days after he said he would send it with no word, a search party started looking for them. When their tent was found, it was abandoned and damaged, and apparently cut open from the inside. Their bodies weren't there, but their belongings were. Footprints were found going away from the campsite, some left by people in socks with only one shoe, and some even barefoot. Their bodies were found in various places away from the campsite, wearing very little clothing, some only in their underwear. Story 13. I cannot remember the details, but during the early parts of the Cold War, a Soviet submarine sank. Knowledge of it was intercepted, but the Soviets guarded this information very tightly, and as far as I recall, never really came out with it. One theory I heard is that Russian vessels were rigged such that an unauthorized launch of its nuclear weapons would cause them to immediately detonate, like by design as a failsafe. I don't know if that's true or not, but whatever I read about this suggested it was a fact that they had this failsafe. Another was that the British had been able to sabotage these weapons after intercepting communications that the Soviets were going to launch a nuclear strike against the US. Both theories rely on the Soviets having tried to launch 2 nukes and starting World War III. Either they were unauthorized and detonated on board, or they were sabotaged and blew up upon launch. More likely, it's some random accident guarded because. Story 14. Yes, that's what they seem to think. Some cases have taken place at the same time in completely different states. Brian Schaffer went missing in March 2006 here in Columbus. Exactly 10 years later, in March 2016, Joey LeBoot disappeared in the same area as Brian. But he is found dead later under the same circumstances as the other house smiley face murders. It's really disturbing to think that this is happening and has been for decades. Actually, some people were posting that similar accidents were taking place in the UK coincidence. I wonder if any smiley faces were found in the area. Story 15. My uncle, who never had a chance to meet him, hired a small yacht with a small group of friends and was going to use it to do sailing holidays as a business. Anyway, they radioed in very early one morning saying they were out of petrol off the coast and were told they would receive petrol in the morning. They went to deliver petrol and never found the boat. They have only ever found one life donut thing and that's it. They think the boat was pirated, and we have reports that they're still alive in different countries, but they've never been substantiated. They also have a sneaking suspicion that the yacht owner had something to do with it, as he acted so dodgy after it all went down. They literally have absolutely no idea what happened. There were no other ships in the area at the time. They thought they could have been run over and sunk by a large ship. Anyway, it is called the Patanella. There is still a huge reward out for any info. Story 16. The lead masks case, Brazil, 1966. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, a young boy was flying a kite on the Morro do Vintém Hill, in Niterói, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, when he came upon the bodies of 2 deceased males and reported them to the authorities. The Morro do Vintém had difficult terrain, and the police were unable to reach the bodies until the next day. When a small team of police and firefighters arrived, they encountered an odd scene. The bodies rested next to each other, partly covered by grass. Each one wore a formal suit, a lead eye mask, and a waterproof coat. There were no signs of trauma or any evidence of a struggle. Next to the corpses, police found an empty water bottle, and a packet containing 2 wet towels. A small notebook was also identified, on which were written the cryptic instructions. In 1630, be at the specified location. 1830, ingest capsules. After the effect of protected metals await the signal mask. The 2 men were identified as Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana, 2 electronic technicians from Campos dos Goitacazes, a town several kilometers to the northeast of Rio de Janeiro. Following an investigation, police reconstructed a plausible narrative of the men's last days. On August 17th, Cruz and Viana left Campos dos Goitacazes with the stated intent that they needed to purchase some materials for work. The 2 men then boarded a bus to Niterói and arrived at 2:30 p.m. Evidence shows that the waterproof coats were purchased at a shop there and 1 bottle of water from a local bar. Upon being interviewed, the waitress from the bar described Miguel as very nervous and noticed he frequently checked his watch. That is the last time they were known to have been seen alive. It is presumed they went directly from the bar to the spot at which they were discovered. No obvious injuries were discovered at the scene, nor later at the autopsy. A search for toxic substances did not occur. The coroner's office was very busy at the time, and when the autopsy was finally conducted, the internal organs of the 2 victims were too badly decomposed for reliable testing. Story 17, the Bronze Age collapse and what caused it. Towards the end of the Bronze Age, all major cities in the Bronze Age were invaded and sacked by an unknown people. We don't know much about them, but we know they traveled by boat, so we refer to them as the Sea Peoples, but we have no idea where they came from, who they were led by, and what their intentions were. Only that other civilizations and cities collapsed that were nowhere close to shore. That Sea People theory is based on one line of a historian without much context, and there's not much other evidence to support the idea of a super marauder people that caused this massive collapse. The most likely explanation is that these supposed sea beast people were a wave of overall piracy across the Mediterranean onset by a dissolution of trade, wealth, and government regulation. In other words, a symptom, not the cause. Story 18. I'm not going to lie, I spent a lot of time just browsing these and looking at what people said. Thanks, everyone. I learned a lot. Though I also didn't, because it's unlikely many of these mysteries will ever be solved. For me, my ancient one is where Alexander the Great is buried. I've been interested in classics for years now, and that's always been a question that I've asked, both where it is and if we'll ever find it. As for the more recent one, this is more difficult. There's plenty for me. I'd have to say a mystery from where I'm from, New Zealand. It's the disappearance of Jensen, a 14-year-old who went missing in 1983 while out riding her horse. It's quite significant within a New Zealand context because unsolved disappearances like this simply aren't that common. Basically, as I said, she was out riding her horse on the night of September 1st, 1983. Her horse was later found alive, but she hasn't been seen since. All signs point to foul play, that she was abducted and murdered that night. That's what I believe too. Unfortunately, we will most likely never know. It's worth noting about that case that a man named John Russell was seen as a suspect by police at the time. His house and truck was searched, albeit with no evidence that Kirsa had been there being located, and he even confessed to the killing in 85, but retracted it later. And police never had enough evidence to prosecute him. Ultimately, police said that there was more suggesting he wasn't involved than that he was. But he died in 1992 and left no note, no last confession or anything. Perhaps he could no longer live with what he did, if he indeed did do it. Again, it's unlikely we will ever know. He took what he may or may not have known with him to the grave. Story 19. The disappearance of the Lake Fayum nomadic people that predated the pharaohs. They had no writing, no records of any form, and lived solely near the banks of the Nile and in an ancient lake. They had a community for a long time that included bakeries, agriculture, weaving, and some precursor to religious or artistic elements. One day, the people vanished. They left their fish in the cooking pots, dry food stored under the floorboards of their houses, and pottery still on the wheel. It was like they were picked up and carried away, or the people suddenly left in a hurry and left everything behind. Then, shortly after, the material culture of early pre-pharaonic Egyptian kingdoms arose. Some believe the Fayum people migrated north to become the early Egyptians because of unusually arid conditions. Others say they were killed or captured, but there were no signs of struggle. They possessed and left no weapons, and that doesn't explain why the people left their entire culture in Story 20. Once you really look into everything that is known about the murder of Lizzie Borden's father and stepmother, you sort of have to accept the fact that unless we straight up find a written confession 130 years later, we have no idea what the hell happened. It didn't help that the police were literally at a fair that day. So most of the squad didn't show up. The doctor on the scene pumped Lizzie full of morphine to help with her hysterics, so nothing she said at the time is of any use. The coroner let the bodies just sit for over 5 days unrefrigerated. And the time frame of the events simultaneously seemed to confirm two things. Nobody from outside of the house could have walked in, killed two people, and walk out absolutely soaked in blood without being seen by multiple people. Nobody who was on the property could have killed two people and completely disposed of the evidence before the police and doctor arrived. It's not the cut and dry case people think it was. It's an enormous mess. Story 21. Who sabotaged Nikola Tesla by setting fire to his six-story laboratory in 1895, destroying most of his life's work and causing him to fall into a deep depression? After this devastating loss, Tesla never seemed to pursue science with the same passionate vigor ever again, and began to become increasingly interested in the occult and pseudoscience, which further distanced him from high society. There are multiple different theories about who committed the arson, all involving different competitors and enemies of Tesla, of which he had a few. Tesla was infamous for rocking the boat in the booming American technological industries and was almost definitely on the spectrum big time, which caused him to usually inadvertently offend a ton of people, especially those who were getting pushed out of the market by him. So it really could have been anyone. And if it was a competitor who started the fire, they would have discreetly hired some random bum to do the job and thus be more or less untraceable. But personally, I think it was Edison.